big World of Warcraft player back in vanilla and the first several expansions. I did like professional raiding, and then I don't know, real life kicked in. But what I don't do is these the first person shooters. They're too fast. It's
Team Fortress
yeah.
2, and I think it's a bit fast, but
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like they're way too fast for me.
What about third person?
Third person, I'm okay with. Yeah. The RTSs, I don't mind, but I don't find them fun because you're always restarting. You're always building from the beginning. It's on PS5, right? Oh, Dark Souls. Yeah, I must not have, I don't remember it that well, but I must not have liked it that much because I think I only played the first one for a little bit. So, see, is that? Yeah, I don't think I played it. I'm the guy who didn't like God of War.
Wow.
I know.
Wait, which one?
The first one.
I like them.
Yeah, I just couldn't get into it. Okay, let's get started now that we've talked video games. All right, so as I was saying, as some of you were coming in, obviously the classroom has at least improved since last class. We have enough seats in here. We've ordered some furniture to try to make this classroom very similar to S109 over there. What the scoop was is this used to be a computer lab. Somebody decided that, oh, it should be a classroom and no longer computer lab. And then they just stopped after they deemed that to be the case and never actually made it in the classroom. Hence, no projector screen, not enough seating for the classes they scheduled in here. But in any case, I'm just enveloping it into our computer science budget for our renovation. We probably won't have new flooring this semester, but hopefully we get new furniture, kind of like the stadium seating they have over there. I'm hoping we can have that within 2 or 3 weeks. We'll have to see. I'm waiting to hear back on how backordered they are. And then an instructor station, they said it's about 6 weeks, but this can function as long as we have adequate seating. But at the very least, everybody can sit in the classroom with the table in front of them right now. So we are improved from last class. All right, so keep in mind this room will continue to evolve. And if the room across the hall gets cleared out, once this part works out, we might just move the class over across the hall to computer science where we already have a room that's set up and can function for this, but we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. Okay, so last time we were talking about, let me see, I have the sharing on. Am I recording? I am recording. Okay, you should have seen that the Blackboard course is open. I have the link to the slides up there. So, and that updates in real time. So if you click on the slides, you can, I mean, you can take notes in here if you'd like, but you'll always have the most up-to-date version of the slides. I also link to the playlist for the recordings for class. So it has last class's lecture up there. It'll have today's lecture up there. So that'll always stay up to date. Yeah, whatever. That's where we'll put assignments and stuff, but no assignments yet. Okay, so talking about CPUs. Last time we mentioned that the CPU is like this collection of magic tricks. I kind of asked, what's the CPU? And you get your common answers like, oh, it's the central processing unit. Like, okay, well, what does that mean? And then we kind of get down to like, oh, it's the brains of the computer and stuff like that. And then remember near the end of class, I was doing like, how many of you can do that thing, right? And wiggle your fingers, all these little tiny mini moves that aren't impressive in and of themselves. But if you put enough of those little tiny motions together, you can accomplish real tasks, picking up a soda bottle, whatever. Okay. So a processor, a CPU is kind of like that. Built into it is a giant collection. I like to call them magic tricks. These are small, little, well, let's call it small abilities that accomplish a seemingly meaningless task. When a bunch of magic tricks are put together, an actual task is accomplished. Okay? That's what a CPU is. All right. And it's built into hardware. So it's considered to be fast, let's say. All right. I think I mentioned also kind of after, as we were wrapping up at the end of class, you know, as when Intel comes out with their next generation, their 9th, 10th, 11th generation Core i7 or Core i9 processor, you know, they say something like, oh, it's up to 75% faster than the previous one, yada, yada, yada. Ultimately, they can legally say that if just one of those magic tricks enhances the performance of something that you used to be able to do slower, something like that. And a lot of times what happens is the they might combine a couple of those commonly used magic tricks. So maybe you have a you know, the grab soda bottle magic trick, which maybe requires 3 ninja moves, right? They turn it into a single magic trick that's just grab soda bottle, and it's 75% faster. Now that processor is 75% faster, up to 75% faster. All right, so don't fall prey to buying the newest, latest, greatest processor if you can get last year's or 2 years ago's model for half the price, unless you've looked into it and the specific thing that they've enhanced on the new processor is something that you commonly do. Then it might be worth it, right? So I'm not arguing that it isn't an improved processor. It just might be something that you're spending 50% extra money on and getting zero benefit from. Make sense? Almost always the newer processors either use less energy overall or give you more at the same amount of energy they're using. But again, that more might be something you're not using. Okay. What about multiple cores? How many of you in here have a computer with at least 4 cores in their processor? If you don't know what I'm talking about, just follow along. Okay. How many of you have at least 8 cores? 16 cores? Okay. After 16 in commercial or in consumer software or consumer hardware, you can buy 32, 48 core and even larger ones that starts getting into server class processors, things like that. Then you have something called hyperthreading, if you've heard of that with Intel, where it can kind of turn one core into like a fake C2 core type thing. That's something you'll learn about in the CSC200 class, the computer organization class. That's something called pipelining, where they sort of kind of stage instructions so that they can kind of get there a half a step faster than they would. And they just call that an extra core, that type of thing. All right. So what does it mean to have multiple cores? So if you have a processor with 4 cores, what does that ultimately mean? Is 4 cores faster than 2 cores faster than 1 core? What's faster mean? Okay. There is truth to that. That's the job of the operating system. It's a Linux thing, so probably not something you're familiar with. But but what is a core? Let's start with that. Processor. So 1 core is a CPU. So now we have this kind of this weird definition of a CPU. When you think of a CPU, if you've ever built a computer, you think of it as that little square thing, right? That you drop on. They used to have pins on them. Now it's, you know, that does the magnet, you know, 0 insertion force, blah blah blah. But effectively, there's a bunch of pinouts on the bottom of this thing. You drop it into this little square thing, and you put a big fan on top of it because it gets super hot, right? Okay, we think of that as a CPU, but the reality is that contains CPUs. So if you have a quad core, one of those, that contains 4 CPUs. An 8 core contains 8 CPUs. If you have a smartphone, how many of you are iPhone users? Okay, your phone probably has at least 4, if not 6 cores. How many of you are Android users? Okay, if it's a newer Android, you probably have 8 cores. Okay, maybe only 4, but probably 8 cores if it's one of the newer flagship phones. So does that mean 8 cores is better than 6 cores? When you start getting into mobile computing, not all of those cores are created equal. So, because these guys are running off a battery, right? So if you're just checking your email, you don't want to be using the same cores as you're using to play a video game or something like that, right? You want to use a low performance core that uses a lot less battery power. And yes, it is slower, but you're not going to notice because you're just checking your email. But it uses a lot less battery power and things like that. So in these mobile devices, they make decisions in their processors to try to extend battery life. But in a desktop class processor, or if you look at like more of a power laptop where they just basically say this is as if it's a desktop, so probably plug it in unless you're going to be, for instance, this laptop gets, I don't know, probably advertises as like 15 or 17 hours of battery life, but that's if I'm doing something very benign on it, right? If I launch a video game on this thing and run it completely off battery, I mean, this guy will probably do better than a lot of laptops. Maybe I'll get an hour and a half, 2 hours out of it, something like that. But, you probably want to get tethered, right? And even on top of that, if I'm running off the battery, a lot of laptops go into like more of a low power mode where they scale down the processors to run a little bit cooler, use a little bit less energy. So then you start having frames drop in your games, all this other stuff. So, this idea of a processor is a very blurry thing. Okay. So when we get to that, the square chip that you drop onto the motherboard, that's something we might call a CPU. But the reality is what I'm describing as a CPU here is one of the several cores that's on those guys. So now we get back to the ideas, is 4 cores better than 2 cores better than 1 core? Well, the answer is it depends. It goes back to the old joke. How many people does it take to change a light bulb? So let's say that I can change a light bulb at speed 10. I'm a single core processor. And you 4 can change a light bulb at speed 8. You're a quad core processor. Who's going to change that light bulb faster? Because I could change a light bulb at speed 10. And if you're changing a light bulb, only one of you is going to be changing a light bulb. It's a one-person job, right? You don't need all 4 of you to do it. Okay, so yes. Now let's take that exact same thing. Let's say I can shovel snow at speed 10. You guys can shovel snow at speed 8. Who's going to clear the driveway faster? You guys are, because you're going to divide the work among 4 workers. And yes, I can shovel snow faster than any individual one of you, but the 4 of you working together are going to clear that driveway way faster than I am. Make sense? That's when multi-core processors really come into play. If you want to see this in kind of the laptop world, not that any of you have ever done this. I'm sure none of you have ever downloaded a movie off the internet or something like that and had to convert it into a format that would run on one of your streaming devices. Nobody in here has done that, right? Okay, so if we take a couple different classifications of machines, let's say you take like a MacBook Air or one of these lightweight laptops that has a fairly low powered processor in it. It's meant for business type stuff. And that machine might feel every bit as fast as some $10,000 desktop computer for most of the tasks you do. If you're checking email, you're browsing the web, you're doing spreadsheets, Microsoft Word. So you got, if we just stay in the Mac world, we have a $1,000 MacBook Air, and we have a $10,000 MacBook Pro, or Mac Pro sitting there. For normal use, those 2 machines are going to feel the same speed. Microsoft Word is not going to be running at a higher frame rate on the Mac Pro than it is on the MacBook Air. So you might say, well, why did I spend so much money on this? It's not any faster. Until you see a task where it does perform faster. So let's say that machine has, physically 2 or 4 physical processors, each with 16 cores in it. So now you have legitimately a 64 core processor. 64 snow shovelers, right? Versus the MacBook Air that has, call it 2 or 4, let's call it quad core, 4 low powered snow shovelers. When you convert a video is kind of like shoveling snow. It's something that you can have each processor take a portion of the video for converting it. So if you go to convert an 1.5-hour movie on that MacBook Air, it might take 30, 40 minutes to do. When you do it on that Mac Pro, it might take like 1 minute or even less. Same movie, same software. Those machines felt the same speed when you're using it for normal circumstances, but for that specific job, you see the speed difference of those machines. Make sense? So the more cores in a processor does not necessarily mean faster, but it could mean faster depending on the types of tasks that you're doing. Most of the software that we write does benefit from more than one processor. We're going to talk about something in here eventually called multi-threading. We actually talk about it a lot more in the next course, but multi-threading is the idea of the software version of having more than one thing happen at once. And the operating system allows, one thing to occur on one of the cores and another thing to occur in another core. So those two things are physically happening separately. But now if we roll back in time, before we had multi-core processors, and we look at a single core processor. At that point in time, with a single core processor, where there's a single CPU, technically only one thing can happen at a time. Having said that, we've had multitasking-based operating systems for a long time. Windows 95 is probably the first consumer version of that that we saw. So let's do a little bit of a rollback in time thing. Just do OSs, and just to keep things, is it a fair thing that most of you are Windows folks? Okay, so let's just do Microsoft OSs. Okay, what's the oldest Microsoft OS you can come up with for me? Windows 90, that didn't even exist. Windows 97, I mean, there were so many years you could have picked, and that isn't even one of them.
Microsoft DOS?
DOS,
Oh,
yeah.
DOS.
Okay. Actually, that's a good story. So we go back to DOS. So disk operating system is what that stands for. This is probably one of the most lucrative purchases ever made in the world. You go way, way, way back in time. Any of you ever watched any of the documentaries on the origin story of Microsoft? All right, so, back then, when personal computers were just becoming something that people could either afford or put on their desks, but we didn't really have a whole lot of uses for them. So at that point in time, it was more of a gadgety thing than anything. Think about smartphones in the early days of smartphones. Now we all have them. When somebody says cell phone, they effectively mean smartphone, right? All right, so way back then, Microsoft wanted to create, get PCs on people's desks. So they went to the cool kid in technology back then. The cool kid in technology back then was IBM, right? Microsoft's now the new IBM, right? They're the suits. They're not the ones with the rock climbing walls at the that's the Googles, and less so Apple. Apple's actually somewhere in the middle, but. All right. So they met with IBM because IBM was starting to get into the world of personal computers because they saw an opportunity to make money. IBM was a hardware company, right? So up to this point, we've been talking about hardware. So where I'm going with this is we're starting to look at that transition between hardware and software, because in here, we're going to learn how to be software developers, right? And we're going to leverage this hardware that's put in front of us to solve our problems. We're not inventing hardware in here. We're inventing software-based hardware. We're doing the same. We're writing magic tricks with C++ instead of with wires and soldering irons. Okay. So Microsoft, Bill Gates and a couple of his buddies, Paul Allen, they go into Microsoft to meet with them. And Microsoft they go into IBM to meet with them. And IBM is, just starting to dabble in this world of personal computers. But they're these are the big boys. They're making, they're the top tech company in the world. So the idea is they're not really bought into this thing. From their perspective, money comes from big corporations, not from people's households. So Microsoft goes in and they convince them. This is probably one of the most profitable meetings in history. They say, look, we're not selling you anything. Instead, every single time you sell one of your computers, your hardware computers, you're going to need an operating system to run that computer. What's an operating system? Okay, well, what does an operating system do? At least you upgrade it from Windows 97, which I don't know where that came from. What's an operating system do? Okay. What did we do before operating systems? And have you ever seen pictures of those computers that filled up like entire gymnasiums? UNIVAC, EDVAC, these old things, these are prior to operating systems. And what did you see on them? You saw these things that look like light bulbs, right? They're called vacuum tubes. So in order to give input to the computer, you had to physically walk up and turn light bulbs on to give a binary number as input. If you wanted to add the number 3 to 5, you would have had to turn on the right light bulbs for the binary number 3. So, 11011 if we're doing 3 bits, something like that. And then the binary number 5, turn on the right light bulbs. And then some light bulbs would light up with your answer for adding those together. That's how you used computers back then. You physically manipulated the computer. Operating systems replace that. Operating systems sit as a software layer that lives between us and the hardware so that we don't have to go in, well, especially as these hardware things get way, way smaller. So we're not, having to use, I don't know, little pins to touch different things or whatever. That's not how we use computers today, but that's how we used to use computers. The reason we don't have to use computers like that today is because of operating systems. That's the job an operating system provides, is to make it easier for a human being to use the computer. Over the years, operating systems evolved, and that's what we're going to talk about here. But Microsoft told IBM, says, look, to reduce your risk, you only give us money when you sell one of your computers. You need our operating system for your computer. So every single time you sell one of your computers, we will get a licensing fee for our operating system, but only if you sell one. From IBM's perspective, it's a pretty good deal, right? In fact, there's a famous quote back then. IBM said, no problem. The real money's in the hardware. Well, I think I told the story last time of one of somebody was in your shoes he was graduated a year ago, who's now writing mobile apps on the side. And he's got like between the third and, depending on the day, the third and the 5th or 6th top ranked app on the Apple App Store, making tons of money. That's not hardware. That's software that he's writing. So today, not that there isn't money to be made in hardware, but that's a very specialized task, and hardware is not easily changeable, right? Software, make a couple changes, recompile it, move on with life, right? So when IBM said the real money's in hardware, Microsoft saw the future with the software. All right, so now they made this deal with IBM that, every time you sell one of your computers, you give us a licensing fee for our operating system, and then you'll have that software to run your computer so that the human being can conveniently use your hardware. Make sense? What was the catch with that meeting? So great deal for Microsoft, except, go ahead. Yeah, they didn't have an operating system. They just made a deal with the biggest tech company on the planet, among the biggest companies on the planet, to license them something every time they sell a computer that they didn't have. So they went out and found somebody who wrote their own operating system. Probably better than the Linux you're going to pump out, I'm guessing. Yeah. So they had written their own operating system called DOS, and this guy had done this on the side, right? Just as a hobby. He was running like a hardware store, like a tech hardware store, because from his perspective, the real money was in the hardware. So he sold DOS to the Microsoft folks for something in the ballpark of about 50 grand. Now, that's a pretty good amount of money back then, especially when this was your toy hobby, right? So if you wrote some little piece of software, even though an operating system we view as a big piece of software, but back then operating systems didn't do anywhere near what they do today. So relatively speaking, an operating system back then was not a huge piece of software. So if you write something just as a hobby between classes or something like that, which I hope as you guys get into programming, you start doing. So I promise you, 90% of what you learn, you are not going to learn in this classroom. I'm going to teach you the skills you need to go out and learn these other things yourself. I'll give you the fundamentals. But if you're a basketball player, coach will give you practice, will teach you the fundamentals, but then you got to go home and you got to practice yourself. You got to shoot 1,000,000 free throws. You got to shoot the jump shots. You got to work on your ball handling skills, whatever it is, right? Okay. School's the same way. Don't expect that you can just sit there in those seats, half falling asleep half the time, and just through osmosis leave and be overly skilled. We're giving you just enough to be dangerous. You go put the time outside, and something good happens. Okay, so let's say that during your freshman year here, or sophomore year, pick your favorite year. You go and you write some little side project that, hey, somebody comes up and says, hey, that's kind of cool. I'll give you 50 grand for it. Who says yes? The only people who didn't raise their hand are the ones who are not listening. They're the half asleep ones, right?
Well,
Okay.
I might consider it.
Yeah.
But
Depends what it is, right? Depends what the software is. But in general, I'm guessing to most of you, 50 grand is a pretty good amount of money. And if you were doing something on the side to learn, and somebody comes and offers you basically tuition for 2 years, you'd probably take it, right? Well, that's what happened. Go ahead.
What happens if it's like you sell it and then they end up making like 10 million off that?
Well, that is what happened here. Well, but then you also have the situation. Let's assume, so let's fast forward a little bit. I'll get back to this, but so let's assume you're already out of school, you're a professional developer, and you write something on the side that and that's what, so the student I'm talking about, his name's Noah Kurz. I'm going to actually have him come and talk to some classes. So we'll have a tech talk and you can meet him and everything. But, so Noah knows that the stuff he's currently working on has value, right? So, he has some offers, I think, in the realm of like $250,000 and stuff like that for it, but he's considering not taking because he knows he has something, right? But now you have the other side of the coin. Let's assume that Microsoft has that software and you have that software. It's the identical software. Who has the capability of making more money off that software? Microsoft has the marketing thing. They have the ability to get into all these stores, all these online marketplaces, all these things. You don't. Your reach is only so far because you're the little guy, right? So at that point, 250 grand might be pretty good, considering what you would have to go through. Not that it's impossible, because all these big companies started off as small companies, right? It doesn't mean that you can't be that, but statistically, you probably are going to be better off just taking the cash and running, right? Unless you really believe in it, just say, look, I'm going to roll the dice and let's see where it goes. But generally speaking, you can't blame this person who took the 50 grand for DOS, right? They did it for a hobby. They didn't even know how this guy found out about it. It was like through some of the, the geek circles or something. Okay, somebody walks in, offers you 50 grand for something that you weren't even planning on trying to sell. You didn't think it had value. You say yes. Nobody would blame them, right? How much did Microsoft make off of DOS? Billions. They made billions off of DOS. All right. Because DOS had a whole bunch of versions. So let's do something like, DOS 1 through DOS. Kind of the last version of DOS that was kind of advertised was DOS 6.22. They did have a DOS 7.0, but that was after Windows had started coming out. So let's just leave it at the 6.22. All right, so roughly 6 versions of DOS released over the years. What's the next operating system that came after DOS on the Microsoft side? And we're gonna be missing some in here, right? Because I promise you, during this thing, we had Unix was being born, but that's on a whole different level over there. That off of Unix came the Linux operating systems. Linux is an open source clone of Unix, and at some point we'll talk about that in one of the classes you have with me. Again, I give you a lot of foundation because that foundation is what builds you into somebody who can go and build multi-million-dollar pieces of software. Sitting there practicing writing if statements is important, but having this foundation of how to get from point A to point B is much more important. And we're going to get into coding. The whole class is not going to be like this, but this foundation, I promise you, is important. Get you excited about where you can go with this. All right. So if we're just looking for the Microsoft lens, and I know a lot of this is before most of you were born. All right. But what's the next Microsoft operating system that came out after DOS? Windows. So there was a Windows 1, but the one that kind of was the first one that people knew about, we're going to say, is Windows 3.1. All right. And we're going to add some commentary on these a little bit here in a few minutes. But what came after Windows 3.1? Actually, no. Windows NT. I think this was 3.51 was the first one that was kind of commercially available. Okay. What's the difference between these two? Windows 3.1 and Windows NT 3.51. Anybody know what NT stands for? New technology. Let me ask another question here. What's a kernel? We're not talking about the fried chicken guy. This is for the military people. What's a kernel? This is the actual operating system. The kernel is the actual OS. All of those other things, Windows, Linux, Unix, Mac OS, are distributions. That is a kernel plus a bunch of software to enhance the base use of the OS. When you get a brand new operating system, you have an expectation of things that might be installed, right? You have kind of a text editor that's on there. You have like maybe a little painting program that's on there. They usually ship with a web browser. Insert other pieces of software that are enhancements to the actual underlying operating system, which we talked about is that piece that sits between the human being and the hardware. Make sense? So you don't have to sit there and turn light bulbs on and stuff like that. Now we use transistors instead of the light bulbs, vacuum tubes, but whatever. All right. So most of these things that on this slide we are calling operating systems are actually distributions. Doesn't really matter. It's just more of a trivia thing, but it's reasonable to call them operating systems because everybody calls them operating systems. But from a geekdom perspective, they're actually distributions. All right. So what was the difference between Windows 3.1 and Windows NT? This guy was based on top of DOS. Windows was a graphical user interface for the DOS operating system. This guy was based on top of the NT kernel. That was actually the first operating system that Microsoft wrote, was the NT kernel. DOS was purchased. NT kernel was, well, probably partially purchased, but significantly more written than DOS was. Go ahead. Yeah. All the DOS is is a base operating system with a non-graphical user interface. This has a graphical interface. This has a graphical user interface. So basically all of them have GUIs after this guy. Yeah, so I wasn't just saying that this guy was a GUI. Both of these are mouse clicky operating systems, graphical user interface operating systems. All right. But even though they looked very similar, they were actually built on top of a different operating system. This one was geared towards business. This was geared towards consumer. What's the next operating system that came out? Go ahead. Windows 95. All right. So what was the big thing with Windows 95? Still basically exists today. What did Windows 95 bring to the table? Bottom left-hand corner for a while. Start button. Yeah, start button. Okay. Yeah, the start button was what Windows 95 brought to the table. But there's also another extremely important thing it brought to the table that all of us take for granted today. We're going to say start button plus what was the thing that Windows 95 brought to the consumer table that we all just assume that operating systems do today that they did not do in Windows 3.1 and before?
The application.
What about them?
Did they like put them on the menus and stuff?
No. How many of you, when you're using your computer, have more than one application open at once?
Oh, no way.
Multitasking. Before Windows 95, the idea of minimizing an application wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing. You get to use one application. When you're done with that one, save your work, close it, and open another application. Make sense? Yet all of us take for granted that that's existed forever. Does your smartphones have multitasking?
I mean, kind of. It like shuts down the app. And then
How many of you ever had the first iPhone? Anybody here have the first iPhone? Starts getting, it's now we're enough removed, right? I think you were probably alive when the first iPhone came out. Well, I mean, the first iPhone was probably 14, 15 years ago, something in that ballpark. Yeah, you were young, right? Okay. First iPhone came out and it was, was not the first smartphone, but it was probably the first phone that by today's definition of smartphone existed. And Apple wasn't a cell phone company, but Apple's Apple, and they make innovative products that are expensive, but usually create a new standard, right? So iPhone comes out. The first iPhone did not have an app store, first of all. App Store didn't exist in the first iPhone. Second year is when the App Store came out for iPhone. The first iPhone also only worked on AT&T. That's a big business loss for Verizon. Because at the time, Verizon was probably one of probably in the US, the biggest cell phone company. Apple went to them first. Wanted to create an exclusive deal with them. Apple's not a smartphone company. Verizon said no. That would have paid a couple of bills. All right. Now it's on all of them, right? But by the time it went on to these other cell phone providers, the money had already been lost, and now Apple has the upper hand, right? But the first iPhone, no app store, fine. But it came with a bunch of apps built onto it. YouTube was built into it. A Safari web browser was built into it. You had some music playing things. How many of you on your smartphones today have music playing while you're checking your email? Couldn't have done that in the first iPhone. No multitasking. One or the other. You pick. About a year after, well, a little more than a year, actually, a year and a half to almost 2 years after first iPhone, iOS came out, Android comes out, and it was rushed to market. Android is built on top of an operating system called Linux. Now, Linux does have multitasking. So right off the bat, Android has multitasking. Did that make Android better than iOS? What do you think?
Probably not. What's the name?
Google made Android, so that's a strong competitor, right? Yeah, so maybe the multitasking was a pretty good deal. You could play your music while you were also checking your email. That sounds great, right? Yeah, for the 2.5 minutes while your battery lasted. Does that mean that Android was junky? No, Android was built on top of an operating system that had great multitasking, but it was an operating system built for computers that are plugged into a wall. It didn't make any decisions based on battery life. They just slapped it onto a battery powered mobile phone. No wonder runs out of battery life in no time, right? How many of you remember the software Flash? It's almost dead now, but there's a couple sites that still have Flash, right? Apple never allowed Flash on any of its iOS devices. People complained about it left and right. Android had Flash in the early days. If any of you ever used the mobile version of Flash, you would realize it was unusable. Technically, you could go to a website that had some Flash stuff on it, and it would technically, by some low definition, work. But it wasn't usable. And Flash was even worse than the multitasking. Flash destroyed your battery. And you can even see this more recently. I mean, Flash is pretty much phased out now, but if you would take a modern laptop and you would put Flash, the full desktop version of Flash on a modern laptop, and you went to a site that ran Flash, that laptop that maybe would get 10 or 12 hours of battery life under normal circumstances, we get like 40 minutes of battery life. Flash was a power hog. It was never meant to be run off something with a battery. Google used to have commercials that bragged about how they had Flash and Apple didn't. And then all of a sudden they just stopped having those commercials. Never actually told their Android users that they got rid of Flash. So way back then, when I was teaching a class, I would ask some loaded question like, how many of you Android users? You always pit them against each other, right? Half of the class is iPhone, half of the class is Android, whatever. How many of you appreciate that you have Flash? You get a bunch of people raising their hand. Yeah, they hadn't had Flash in years. Flash hadn't been on their phone in years. Android just took it off because it was killing their battery. You accidentally stumble upon a website that had Flash on it and then leave that website. Remember, you're on an operating system that has multitasking, so that website's still running in the background, just destroying your battery. While the multitasking is also destroying your battery, you have no battery life. That was Android's biggest problem, was no battery life. So the mobile world's a little bit different argument. And sometimes from a technology perspective, when we think something is missing and, they must not be very good, why they leave that out? Sometimes there's a good reason why they left it out. We have to make design decisions around some of those things. All right. Well, so kind of flipping back over to this, Windows 95 had our start button. So it was the first operating system that kind of brought us our modern day feel for what the interface for an operating system feels like. I mean, if you go to a modern, Linux operating system with one of their GUIs, they all have kind of a start menu-esque X-windowing system. Feels like Windows, right? Even the latest version of Windows 11, yeah, they don't have the bottom left-hand corner start button, but it basically is still there, right? Somewhere in there, they kind of got rid of the start menu. That didn't go over very well, so they went right back, went right back to the start button because people like start buttons where you start. That was always the funny thing with the Mac fanboys who would always say, oh, the Mac OS is so much better, blah, blah, blah. Well, the Mac OS, you didn't know where to start. There's no start button. I guarantee you put Windows 95 in front of Grandpa and you put the Mac OS in front of Grandpa, Grandpa's going to know where to start on Windows because it says start. It was the better OS from a usability perspective. It wasn't as stable. Does that mean Mac wrote better operating systems? No, they stole it from the right place. Modern day Mac OS is built on top of OpenBSD Unix. Might as well take a nice stable operating system, throw a fancy front end on it that looks good. Mac OS, no problem. Microsoft did the same thing. They, outside of 50 grand to Microsoft, which then was something, but now is nothing. They stole it, right? You know, ish, but they stole plenty of other things. It was fine. All right. Really, they stole their graphic user interface from Apple, who was handed their graphic user interface from, any of you heard of a little company called Xerox? What does Xerox do? They're a printer company, right? Well, Xerox, during these early days of personal computers, Xerox was working on a product codenamed Xerox Star, their own personal computer. And then they decided, you know what? Real money's in copy machines. Yeah, we've blown too much on this little pet PC project. So they handed it over to Apple and their engineers, who then released the first Mac that had a graphic user interface and used the mouse. And inside of Apple computers, they had competing product lines. Apple was still making the Apple product line, which was actually running DOS because they were partners with Microsoft. So they were licensing DOS for Microsoft, and then they were working on the Mac, which had their own Mac OS on it, which was not, well, given to them by Xerox, which then Microsoft stole and wrapped into Windows 3.1. Oh, that's how big business works. It's great. These people they've been gut punching each other for years. All right. So don't demonize any of them. They're all bad. And yet, as consumers, we all benefit. Because the more they infight, the more they try to one-up each other, the better products we get. You know, in the early days of iPhone versus Android, any Android person who said that was the better product was deluding themselves. Apple was the better product. But today, we have legitimate competition between those two, right? Somebody who says, hey, I just like Android better than iPhone, it is not an inferior product. There are things that are better about Android. There are things that are better about iPhone. I would say Android, you have to reboot maybe a little bit more often or something like that, but you also get some perks that, you know, you don't get on iPhone. You know, sometimes it's little things you don't even think about. Biggest feature that I value on Android that does not exist on iPhone is the ability to create a flexible hotspot. Now, those of you who are iPhone users, you have the thing that you can turn your phone into a hotspot, right? Those of you who are Android users, you have the thing that can turn your phone into your Android into a hotspot to share your data with over Wi-Fi, right? But they're not created equally. For iPhone, when you turn on hotspot, 100% of the time, you're sharing your cellular data. For Android, you can share cellular data or the Wi-Fi you're currently connected to. Every now and then, you might be connected to a Wi-Fi that somebody else does not have access to, that you want to share internet access to them with. You can share the Wi-Fi you're connected to on an Android device with someone else using their hotspot. Now, maybe that's a big deal to some people. Maybe it's nothing, but I found a lot of great uses for it. My wife and I go on a lot of cruises. And when you buy internet on a cruise, you pay per device. Well, I only need one device. Put my phone on it when I can always just create an unlimited number of devices by setting up my hotspot on my phone if I'm on Android. Make some sense? So it's little interesting things like that. But the point is the iOS and Android, these are legitimate competitors today. You know, nobody's deluding themselves when they say one is better than the other. Some people hate Apple just because they're Apple and all this other stuff, but now they're legitimately good products because they've competed with each other for years. You know, they steal each other stuff from each other, all that jazz. All right. So Windows 3.1 was based on DOS, built for consumers. Windows NT was built on a brand new operating system called the NT kernel, new technology kernel, was built for business users. Kind of Microsoft took two little different tracks, right? Windows 95 comes out. This is our modern day interface with that introduced multitasking. Technically, multitasking was first introduced in Windows NT. But Windows NT still used the Windows 3.1 user interface. So Windows 95, the consumer model, got the new interface plus the multitasking. What came after Windows 95? Windows NT 4.0. What was Windows NT 4.0? Well, basically it brought in Windows 95 UI. It was the NT stability for business with multitasking, but now with the award-winning Windows 95 start button-based UI. Still for business. Next, what's the next operating system that came out? Somebody said it a minute ago. Windows 98. All right. So this is the first time they, you know, just to really confuse the thing, they stopped calling it DOS. Now this thing is based on top of the 9X kernel. Which was basically DOS. they just called it the 9X kernel. Okay. You know, because it sounds more techy, right? Okay, this is still consumer operating system. Really, 98 did not bring substantial stuff to the table over 95, except more driver support and things like that. So you had more things built into it for graphics cards, video cards, or audio cards, things like that. All right, so call it a upgraded Windows 95. Okay. And probably was built on top of a newer rendition of DOS that they now called not the 9X kernel. All right, what came after 98? Okay, yeah, same thing. Well, are you calling those the same thing? Well, it's important because you're either right or wrong. Okay, good answer. So he wants to say Windows 2000. What can you tell me about Windows 2000? Put yourself in the shoes. This is back when operating systems were sold at stores like Best Buy and things like that, when they actually sold software there. Now everything's downloaded off the web, right? If you're a consumer that's currently running Windows 98 at home, and you're walking through the aisles of Best Buy and you see Windows 2000 on the shelf, first thing that pops in your mind is, oh, there's a new version of Windows. Windows 2000 sounds like an upgrade to Windows 98. This was based on top of the NT kernel. And it was for business users. Big problem there. A lot of people went out and bought Windows 2000 to upgrade their Windows 98, thinking that was the new version of the consumer operating system. It wasn't. It was the business operating system. To this day, there are people who still run Windows 2000 as a server software. It was a great operating system. To this day, by any standard, it's still a great operating system. But if you're writing operating systems for consumers versus operating systems for business users, would you say that consumers at home for families have different needs than businesses? The biggest thing was at home, Windows 98 had all sorts of drivers in it for graphics cards and things like that for video, to make video games playable and stuff like that. The business version of the operating systems didn't have any of that. That required new software because those drivers were written for the 9X kernel, not for the NT kernel. So all these people went and upgraded their Windows 98 to Windows 2000, and now none of their stuff works. Joysticks don't work. Graphics cards don't work. Sound cards don't work because business computers didn't need those gaming things. Make sense? All right. Very unfortunate naming convention that Microsoft took there, right? Before they were keeping them separate by always keeping that NT, couple letters in there. But now all of a sudden they did a bait and switch, Windows 2000. All right. So what was the next operating system? This is what we're about to do is we're putting in the death of the consumer line of the, really the death of the 9X kernel. We had an OS called Windows ME. Windows Millennium Edition. So when ME came out, it broke a zillion things for a bunch of people. This is the consumer OS. Still running on the 9X kernel. When Dell computers started shipping their machines with ME on it, within a couple of months, they started allowing those users to upgrade back to Windows 98. Next one is Windows XP. Windows XP is probably the most important operating system on this list from a modern perspective. This brought consumer and business together under the NT kernel. So this operating system still had all of the drivers for graphics cards and stuff like that. So that move to Windows XP, they had to go out and talk to all the different, graphics card people, audio card people, and have them rewrite or at least recompile their drivers to run on the NT kernel. And that'll make sense once we get into the actual software stuff, what it means to compile and that kind of stuff, so that it would run on the NT kernel when it used to only run on the 9X kernel. So they brought in the stability of the NT kernel that was on the business side of things and brought in the flexibility and let's call it more home entertainment stuff from the consumer operating system under a single window, single Windows XP. Huge leap for the consumer operating system. Because now all of a sudden the proverbial blue screen of death was much less common. Not uncommon, but less common. All right. What's the first operating system some of you used from Windows? Was XP the early one?
Yeah.
Oh, Vista?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll throw that one out there yet. I'm going to start skipping some of the server operating systems that are in here just for, let's say, time. From this point forward, even to today, all of Microsoft's operating systems are built on top of, evolving versions of the NT kernel. But the difference between Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP, let's say, is software that's on there. Things that are for running servers, managing users, network stuff, things like that. Okay. It wasn't a difference in the core operating system. There could be some decisions in the core operating system that made it, from a performance perspective, lean towards business uses versus consumer uses, but it was still the same OS. All right. So we had Windows Vista. What was wrong with Windows Vista? Inconvenient to use. Now, at this point in time, Microsoft is as much as the Apple people might want you to believe that there was legitimate competition between the people running Mac OS and Windows, the install base was roughly 99% Windows and 1% everybody else. Probably 0.9% Mac OS, and then the rest was Linux or flavors of Unix, whatever. Microsoft had a extreme dominance in the operating system market, which will never go away. What's going to go away is the idea of the desktop operating system market, because now it's merging with the mobile market. So now you have these hybrid computers that kind of run both. They're going to become more. So you're going to see innovations in the mobile iOS and Android stuff coming onto what are our PCs. So some of you have already seen it with like Chromebooks. If you ever had Chromebooks in high school or something like that, that was effectively a kind of a move in that direction, where all your applications are web-based or streamed. Not sure that's the solution yet, but that's the direction we're rolling. Well, with Microsoft having such a huge install base, what you ended up having is they were a big target for the bad people. You know, the people who wrote viruses and things like that, right? So what they did is, I mean, Microsoft wanted to protect their users because they didn't want, you know, people to sway away from Microsoft because they were under attack. You know, at the time, Mac users would say, well, Macintoshes don't have viruses. Well, it's not because your Mac is that much more secure. I mean, I could probably make the argument that at this point in time, there's a whole nother backstory with Apple that we'll talk about next class, but Apple computers at this time were based on Unix. So realistically, they probably were more robust, a little bit more secure, but not because Apple did anything special. It's because the operating system they took was a long time server-based operating system. All right. But the reality was, it wasn't that viruses didn't exist for Mac. It's that if you're a virus writer, one of your jobs is to tick people off, right? And if you're targeting people to tick off, do you want to target the 99% of the people or the 1% of the people? The 99. You just don't write viruses for the Mac OS because it's not worth your time. It wasn't that Mac OS didn't have viruses. Well, it sort of was, but it wasn't because it was more secure necessarily. It's because nobody was going to waste their time attacking Mac users. Because Mac users probably would have just blamed it on Windows users. But so Microsoft, being the main target for viruses, came out with Vista, which put a lot of protections in there against your machine getting infiltrated with viruses. But it came at the cost of being inconvenient to use. Microsoft Windows Vista was very chatty. Anything you wanted to do on your operating system, it asked you if you really wanted to do this. And they would even ask again, just triple checking. Are you sure? So you had to click. Well, and all the commercials, all the Mac versus PC commercials that were going on back then, it had the PC guy standing there with like a Secret Service guy over his shoulder. You know, like, you don't want to click that, just kind of like. So it was inconvenient to use your computer because you had to click 3 times to do something that should have only required 1 click. So we're going to call this a great OS. It really was. Windows Vista was not a bad operating system, but inconvenient to use, because what they put into Vista was a whole lot of stuff that did protect the consumer. They just involved the consumer too often in those decisions. When realistically, we might say, you know what? If you're having to ask me 3 times whether I should do something, I probably shouldn't be doing it. So why didn't you just make the decision for me rather than ask me about it 3 times? Hence Windows 7. Windows 7 is a less chatty Windows Vista. Make sense? And then we can kind of go down the line. We hit the, there was kind of sort of Windows 8, then we have Windows 10, we have Windows 11, which is out now. But at this point in time, I mean, you effectively are just having innovations within the same operating system that, quite frankly, is pretty solid. Just in our last minute here, the one thing I'll say, because you do see it, that a lot of times Apple users demonize Microsoft, or, well, just not even Apple users, just people in general demonize Microsoft. When you look at the two companies, and we'll talk about this more next class when we talk about the Apple side of things, which is actually a fascinating story that I'm thinking that most of you did not know. But Microsoft is solving a significantly harder problem than Apple is solving. When Apple makes their operating systems, which are good, they're stable operating systems, they run great, all this stuff, they're writing it for their own hardware. That operating system runs on 11 different machines, some MacBook Pros, some MacBooks, some iMacs, that kind of stuff. And they control the hardware. They control the graphics cards that are in that hardware. They don't need to have 500 different drivers for graphics cards. They have to have like 3. Okay. Microsoft does not control the hardware side of things. They're writing an operating system that runs on millions of configurations of different hardware. So anybody who says that Windows is a little bit less stable than Mac OS is probably right. But Windows is shockingly stable when you consider the problem they're having to solve. Make sense? All right. So what we're going to start off with next class is we're going to talk about the Apple story. And that's a good one. Then we're going to transition back to the programming stuff. So we're going to keep trucking. Sound good?
Yeah.
Questions, comments, concerns, bribes? Hey, it's never too often to start, never too early to start bribing your teachers.
I might have to bribe you to stop bullying.
It's not going to happen. That is not, I mean, you open yourself up to it.
Yeah.
What are the different supplies for bribes? Do snacks count?
Snacks are almost the only ethical thing that counts. I can't take money.
Yeah, I would say,
But if I accidentally eat some bacon or candy, something like that.
What
Yeah.
type of candy would be an acceptable bribing?
Well, you don't get to be my size, be overly picky.
Did you bring it?
Yeah, I'll get peanut butter cups. Starbursts are good for snacks. My wife loves Jelly Bellies.
What about whatchamacallit?
Whatchamacallits are fine. It's old, but I mean, it's still.
Old.
Hey, it's candy. I remember when any of you have are paydays still around?
Yes.
I remember when paydays were invented.
I love payday.
You got them at the Ben Franklin nickel store.
Paydays are
Did
awesome.
you ever watch that video of Steve-O getting a 10% discount from the WAD?
Oh, for on Mac stuff. I maybe have seen. I've seen tons of that crap over the years.
It's so bad.